This video is on mechanisms of evolution. Evolution we're describing as a change over time within a population or from one species to another species. And so I really want to talk about how populations evolve. When we think about how populations evolve, the fancy way to say that is, what are the mechanisms of evolution? What are the mechanisms for how evolution occurs? Okay. We know that there needs to be variation in a population in order for evolution to occur. And variation can be introduced by mutations, by shuffling genes. One mechanism for evolution is natural selection. Organisms best fit for their environment survive and reproduce, and other organisms die out. Okay, and this works on the phenotype based on the genotype. And we went through a whole process of evolution via natural selection. There's variation in a population, like let's say there's variation in fur color of the mice. Okay, that's inherited through gametic DNA. There's genes for fur color. And then over time, there's overproduction of these mice, and they compete for limited resources. And then some of the mice are selected for, some of the mice are selected against and die off. And the organisms that are most successful at survival and reproduction over many generations become more dominant. And so the adaptation is whatever allows that group of organisms to survive in their environment, maybe camouflage or something like that. So this is the idea of like evolution via natural selection. Natural selection is not random, okay? It's due to evolutionary fitness. And that word fitness is so important. Fitness, the ability to survive and reproduce. So if you live to be 100 and had no kids, you're less evolutionarily fit than if you lived to be 50 and had 5 kids, right? So evolutionary fitness is survival and reproduction. So we've talked a lot, pretty extensively, about natural selection. This video is actually going to focus on 2 other mechanisms that can lead to evolution. The first one is known as genetic drift. Okay, genetic drift, we have chance events that affect a population. These are typically fairly random, meaning we have no selection for fitness. And these often impact small populations more. So I want to go over a couple examples of genetic drift, but I think it's also important to note that this often leads to a decrease in genetic diversity. Okay, so let's start with our example of bottleneck effect. Okay, bottleneck effect is often caused by some sort of natural disaster, drought, fire, something like that. Okay. So this is our first example we're going to go over of a type of genetic drift called the bottleneck effect. Okay, caused by natural disasters often. Okay. So here's a general idea of how bottleneck effect works. You have an original population that is large and varied. So the beads inside this bottle are supposed to represent the original population. Maybe you have a bunch of blue beads, and you have some green beads, and you have some magenta beads, and you have some yellow beads. You can see the different colors. There you go. Okay. And then there's some sort of bottlenecking event. Okay. And that bottlenecking event is really what we're talking about in terms of the natural disaster. So let's say there's a drought. Okay. And not very many organisms survive. The organisms that do survive, however, aren't as varied as the original population often. So let's say a blue and a green bean survive or bugs survive. Okay, so after the bottlenecking event, you have a surviving population, but in this case, it's only made up of blue and green beads. Okay, this population could expand again. You could have a huge population of whatever this bean is. However, it would only have the alleles that are present in the surviving population. Okay, so even though the original population was more varied and had a bigger allele frequency, like many more different alleles, they're not present in their surviving population. And if those genes aren't hidden as recessive alleles, then the surviving population is going to be much more genetically limited. Okay, so this genetic variation is greatly decreased here. Okay, and a lot of times this can lead to disease and infertility. So a great example of this is cheetahs. So scientists think that the original population of cheetahs was very varied, more varied in maybe their immune system, their size, their ability to reproduce. So they had a lot more variations, a lot more alleles present. And then scientists think there was some sign of natural disaster, probably a drought, and only a few of the cheetahs survived. And the cheetahs that survived were not representative of all the original, did not have all the genes present in the original population. So these cheetahs reproduced and made a whole new population of cheetahs. However, the genetic variability was limited, right? Like in this example, even if this population reproduces, there's only going to be blue and green beans, right? And so now with cheetahs, you can actually do a skin graft from one cheetah to another. And that cheetah that had the skin graft acts like that graft is part of its own skin because there's such little genetic variability. It seems like a same graft, okay? And cheetahs often have some virility issues. They have trouble with reproduction because of this limited gene pool that they have here. So bottleneck effect, you have a big population, and then something causes it to go down to a very small population, and then you end up maybe with a bigger population, but with much less genetic diversity as compared to the original population. That's one example of genetic drift. A second example of genetic drift we can talk about is the founder's effect. The founder's effect is when a small population leaves to start a new colony. This is another example of genetic drift, and once again, it decreases variation. So this original population had like 20 blue dots and had 10 red dots. Okay. But the population that left to start a new colony was made up of 1 blue dot and 3 red dots. Okay, so it's not representative of the original sample, and there's probably some other genes here that weren't represented at all as well. So really, we've taken a small population from this original population, sent it to a new location, and the new location, only these organisms can interbreed, right? So an example of this would be like if there's a large population of birds on the mainland, and some are blown off course by the wind to a small island. Yes, this original colony still exists on the mainland, but these birds that were blown off course to this small island will only be able to interbreed with each other if they can't get back over to this original mainland. And so the diversity, the genetic diversity of this small new founders population is going to be much less than the original population. So bottleneck effect and founders effect are both examples of genetic drift. They decrease variation and they're random. There's really no selection for fitness. There are other kind of environmental conditions leading to them. The last example, the last mechanism for evolution that we're going to discuss is this idea of gene flow. Okay, gene flow is when organisms with different alleles migrate or move between populations. This is often random, but this actually increases variation. So let's say that this right here, let me zoom out a little bit, that this right here is population 1. And this right here is population 2. And this right here is population 3. Okay, so these are 3 populations of organisms of the same species. Okay, and let's say population number 1 is made up of mostly circle versions of this species. And population 2 is made up mostly of star versions of this species. And population 3 is made up mostly of square versions of this species. Well, if an organism from population 3 moves to population 1, you've increased the diversity of population 1. Same thing, if an organism from population 1 moves down to population 3, and you can continue to expand the genetic diversity of these populations by allowing for organisms to migrate between the populations. You end up with populations that are much more genetically diverse than the original population. Okay, and this is called gene flow. So we've talked about 3 main mechanisms for evolution. Natural selection is due to evolutionary fitness. Genetic drift decreases variation, and 2 examples are bottleneck effect and founder effect. And then gene flow increases variation and when organisms move between these populations. The next thing we'll talk about in a different video is this Hardy-Weinberg model. This is a way to mathematically calculate whether or not evolution could be occurring based on shifts in allelic frequencies. But we'll talk about that later. Thanks so much for watching the video.